Hello everyone, Richard here, and today we're going to be looking at the third weapon added in the Rival Incursion update, the LOK-1 Smart Rifle. The LOK clearly takes heavy influence from the M56 Smart Gun from the Aliens franchise, having similar auto-target capabilities, however, in a much more compact design. Like the other additions in this update, the LOK is available for unlock once you reach level 20 Engineer and requires the completion of a special weapon assignment. The LOK is unique in that its primary mode of firing requires the player to hold down the fire button, lock onto enemies, and then release the fire key to begin firing. You are able to lock onto all hostile creatures and fester fleas, however you cannot lock onto cave fauna and loot bugs. Tapping the fire button will also fire the weapon semi-automatically, however at a very slow fire rate and lacking many of the overclock and upgrade bonuses. Out of the box, the Smart Rifle will deal 21 damage per shot, giving it significantly higher per shot damage than the stubby SMG. One downside is that you are not guaranteed to hit weak points on an enemy, meaning you will have to position yourself accordingly to deal maximum damage. Against weaker enemies, this isn't much of an issue, but against Praetorians and Oppressors, it's almost a necessity. Magazine size comes standard at 36 rounds, giving you 3 full volleys of LOKs with a standard configuration. The LOK's total ammo pool is 180 rounds and is by and large the Smart Rifle's biggest weakness. While the LOK does pack a decent punch and can be used in highly efficient ways, there are a lot of confounding variables in the din of battle that will degrade your ammo economy. Fire rate for tap firing is fairly slow at 360 rounds per minute or 6 shots per second. However, it fires significantly faster when firing at locked on targets. This further emphasizes that you should really only be using tap firing for dealing with loot bugs or other objects you can't lock onto. Reloads are the slowest out of all the Engineer primaries, taking 3 seconds versus the 2 seconds it takes for both the Stubby and the Warthog. This is another unfortunate downside of the LOK-1, as you will usually only get 3 or 4 good volleys before having to reload. The base LOK will have a lock-on range of 25 meters or around 82 feet, which in most cases is plenty of reach even for targeting web and acid spitters. This can be improved to 35 meters with zoom lens, but the advantages of this are pretty minor compared to other upgrades in that tier such as macro lens. You can target up to 12 rounds per volley. This does not mean 12 enemies necessarily, as you can stack multiple LOKs on one enemy. This also can be upgraded to 18 with aperture extension, but typically the reduced lock-on time of shutter speed sensor is overall more useful. Locking on and losing a LOK has a threshold in degrees, and by default the area in front of the weapon that it will acquire LOKs is within 10 degrees, while it will lose LOKs if they travel past 70. While 10 degrees does sound small on paper, in actual use it covers a rather significant area of your screen and can actually make target discrimination a challenge. Finally, the LOK comes with a nice bonus, an armor breaking bonus of 150%, allowing it to punch through enemy armor and leave them vulnerable to your teammates. The LOK, in my opinion, is initially a bit more daunting than the other weapons added, especially when deciding what role to fill. Is it a big game hunter, wave clearer, or somewhere in between? For our first build, we'll be going with a wave clearing primary that can handle large amounts of weak enemies with high efficiency if used properly. As with all our builds, we'll be starting with our overclock, and in this case, we will be using explosive chemical rounds. This triggers an explosion on enemies with 3 or more LOKs when the last round strikes them. It's important to understand what it means by the last round. It doesn't mean the last round out of the volley necessarily. If you lock onto an enemy 3 times and the first round kills it, the first round will trigger the explosion. This makes it very effective against swarmers and shockers, since both of these enemies will die to a single round from the LOK and instantly trigger an explosion if they have more than 3 LOKs on them. Unfortunately, this overclock does come at the expense of losing some damage and reducing your total ammo by 36, but most of this will be well compensated for with upgrades. First, expanded ammo bags will give us 72 additional rounds. This will give us more damage potential than the other upgrade, since we're relying on the explosive effect of our weapon to deal damage rather than raw kinetic power. For tier 2, macro lens will give us a much narrower lock-on radius, allowing us to focus in on enemies and be able to consistently get 3 LOKs and not waste them by spreading them over multiple enemies. At tier 3, you'll want to have electrochemical rounds granting bonus damage against enemies that are burning or electrocuted. More on that later. While smart targeting sounds tempting, it actually can interfere with getting 3 locks on weaker or wounded enemies, thus preventing us from using our overclock's main feature. Next, shutter speed sensor will allow you to acquire locks more quickly on enemies and can make chaining volleys a much quicker process. Aperture extension is also viable, but overall with this build, it's about quickly stacking short 3 to 5 lock bursts to proc explosive chemical rounds. Finally, at tier 5, to help synergize with electro-chem rounds, we will take the electrical generator mod, electrocuting targets with 3 or more locks on them. This build is highly dependent on a tempo of getting 3 to 5 locks on a target, firing, and repeating the cycle in order to constantly proc explosions. This makes it highly efficient at dealing with groups of grunts, swarmers, and shockers as long as you can properly isolate a target and get a triple lock. Avoid using this against bigger enemies, obviously circumstances permitting. This build is highly geared towards killing groups of enemies as opposed to single targets. Our next build will revolve around the Executioner Overclock, drastically increasing lock-on speed and the amount of damage dealt to weak points with full lock-ons at the cost of reduced total locks, magazine size, and max ammo. This is sort of the opposite of the explosive chemical round build and is ideal for dealing with tough single targets rather than large groups of weak enemies. Oddly enough, we end up using these same skills, although for somewhat different reasons. Tiers 3 and 5 work in synergy still, electrocuting targets and subsequently dealing bonus damage with electrocution applied. Macro lens will serve the same purpose basically and allow us to focus down a single target and not get lock-ons from all over the cave. As for how to use this build, make sure you're getting the maximum number of locks and that you're targeting weak points on enemies so you can take full advantage of this overclock's bonuses. Unlike the last build, try to avoid killing too many weak enemies or going for wave clears with the LOK-1. This is specifically set up for killing guards, praetorians, oppressors, and the like. For secondary weapons, I would recommend staying flexible and going with a complementary build for either the PGL or the breach cutter. For dealing with single targets, a return to sender build for the cutter or hyperpropellant for the PGL would be my recommendation. For dealing with waves, either Clean Sweep or Fat Boy for the PGL can work well, although Fat Boy does have the hazard of possibly hurting yourself or teammates. For grenades, I typically prefer the Plasma Burster or Proximity Mines. Proximity Mines can be a hazard, however, as they can damage you if you happen to fall back through them with bugs on your tail. As far as perks are concerned, there are no specific recommendations that come to mind for the LOK-1 other than the usual near-essential active perks that include Beastmaster, Field Medic, and Iron Will. If you plan on using Fat Boy, the Friendly perk can be a smart choice since it will greatly reduce the amount of friendly fire damage dealt to teammates. Born Ready is also a good option as it counters the slow reload speed of both the Breach Cutter and the LOK-1 so long as you switch weapons often. The LOK-1, like the Drak, is a weapon that is heavily defined by its overclocks, giving it a lot of build flexibility and making it very competitive in the right hands. However, the lock-on system is not instantaneous and can be awkward with large clusters of enemies. The lock will require a lot of deliberate use and space in order to properly bring it to bear on the enemy. Overall, the lock is a very powerful weapon, but it does require you to play a more active role in using it. However, with a little bit of intelligence, the smart rifle can easily carry your team to victory. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I know there are a lot more builds out there for the lock, so by all means, share them in the comments section below. Join us next time when we take a look at the final weapon, the corrosive sludge pump for the driller. Until then, happy hunting.